Puerto Rico makes billions. Right now, today, some of the most valuable medicines on Earth are being manufactured on this island. Pfizer, Amgen, Johnson & Johnson, the biggest pharmaceutical names on the planet, all have operations here, and they're not leaving. In 2024, Puerto Rico exported nearly $48 billion worth of goods, and most of it, drugs, making this island the second largest pharmaceutical exporter in the entire United States. Nearly $25 billion every year. And yet, 41.55% of Puerto Ricans live below the poverty line. The lights go out, the doctors are leaving, and the young people are already gone. And the island is slowly emptying. So where exactly is all of that money going? That's the question that nobody in Washington wants to answer. And the deeper you dig, the more disturbing the answer gets. Because what's happening in Puerto Rico isn't a story about poverty. It isn't a story about laziness or mismanagement or bad luck. It's a story about a system, one that was deliberately designed to extract wealth from this island generation after generation and leave just enough functioning infrastructure to keep the machine running. A system that looks from the outside like development, but functions from the inside like a slow drain. This is Puerto Rico, and this is how it is dying. To understand what's happening now, you need to understand how the money flows. And the honest answer is that most of it never really belonged to Puerto Rico at all. Now, after World War II, the island launched an aggressive industrialization strategy, Operation Bootstrap, that offered American corporations something almost too good to be true. You set up your factory in Puerto Rico, you enjoy zero corporate taxes, get full access to the U.S. market, and keep every dollar of profit you make. Thousands of companies took the deal. The economy transformed almost overnight. Manufacturing replaced agriculture. Pharmaceuticals replaced sugar. And by the 1970s, Puerto Rico looked like a miracle, a Caribbean success story that the rest of the developing world was studying and trying to copy. But here's the thing about a miracle built on someone else's money. When the money leaves, so does the miracle. Section 936 of the U.S. tax code was the legal engine behind the whole arrangement. It let American corporations repatriate every cent of profit that they made in Puerto Rico back to the mainland, completely tax-free. Congress phased it out starting in 1996 and killed it entirely by 2006. The result was immediate and catastrophic. Factories closed. Hundreds of thousands of jobs vanished. The economy entered a recession it has never really left. And here's the paradox that still holds today. The pharmaceutical giants did stay. The drugs kept shipping. The billions kept flowing. But that money doesn't stay on the island. It belongs to corporations headquartered in New Jersey and New York and London. Puerto Rican workers do show up, they make the product, and they get paid a fraction of what a mainland worker would earn. And they watch their profits disappear across the water. The Bureau of Economic Analysis has confirmed this repeatedly. You strip out pharmaceuticals and a handful of multinational industries, and Puerto Rico's underlying local economy has been contracting for most of the past decade. The GDP number looks impressive. The lives of the people who live here, it tells a different story. And then there's the Jones Act, a law passed in 1920 that says any goods shipped between two U.S. ports must travel on vessels built in the U.S., owned by Americans, and crewed by Americans. That sounds like an unremarkable piece of maritime policy, but for Puerto Rico, it's a slow-motion economic stranglehold. Now, Puerto Rico sits in the middle of major Atlantic shipping lanes. The logical way to supply the island is to let passing cargo ships drop off goods on their way through. The Jones Act makes that illegal. Instead, everything has to be offloaded in Florida, transferred to a U.S. flagged ship, and then sent down to Puerto Rico at roughly double the cost. Economists estimate that the Jones Act adds about $1.4 billion to Puerto Rico's annual costs. That extra burden lands on ordinary families. Food on the island costs 10 to 25% more than what it would cost in Florida. Around 41% of Puerto Ricans are food insecure. A territory this productive, this export-driven, has people going hungry. Not because there's no money, but because a century-old shipping law makes basic goods unaffordable. There's a phrase that economists use for economies like Puerto Rico. They call it a transfer economy. The production happens here, but the gains, they accumulate elsewhere. Puerto Rico is one of only 3 places in the world that lose more than 30% of the income generated within their own borders. The other 2 are Equatorial Guinea and Iraq. That tells you something about the nature of that agreement. And that's where the system starts to break. By the mid-2000s, Puerto Rico was in serious trouble. The economy had contracted. Tax revenue was collapsing. The government faced an impossible choice. You either cut services or you borrow money to keep things running. They chose to borrow, and Wall Street was delighted to help. Puerto Rican bonds came with a unique feature. They were triple tax exempt, meaning that investors paid no federal, state, or local taxes on returns. That made them extraordinarily attractive. And critically, a 1984 law had quietly made it illegal for Puerto Rico to declare bankruptcy. Investors felt completely protected. The island could just borrow, and they did, right through the 2008 financial crisis, issuing new debt to pay old debt, borrowing to fund basic services, stacking obligations on top of obligations. By 2015, Puerto Rico's public debt had reached $74 billion. That figure rises to roughly $120 billion when pension obligations are included. In June of that year, Governor Alejandro Garcia Padilla went on television and said something that shocked even the most pessimistic analysts. "The debt is not payable," he said. "This is not politics. This is math." Wall Street's response was not sympathy. It was opportunity. Vulture funds, firms that specialize in buying distressed debt at pennies on the dollar and then squeezing full repayment through the courts, had already been circling. By 2015, these funds controlled nearly half of Puerto Rico's outstanding debt. They had every incentive to make sure that the island kept paying, no matter the cost to the people that were living there. Congress responded with PROMESA, the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act, signed into law in 2016. It creates the Financial Oversight and Management Board, known locally as La Junta. 7 members, appointed by the U.S. president, and no input from Puerto Ricans. There's no vote, no accountability to anybody on the island. Their mandate was quite clear. You get the creditors paid and get the territory back to a position where it could borrow again. Several board members had direct ties to the financial industry, including firms that had helped create the debt crisis in the first place. Now they were running the island. And when La Junta got to work, the cuts were pretty brutal. The board's executive director earned $625,000 a year. That's roughly 24 times the median Puerto Rican household income. That number isn't a footnote. It tells you everything about whose interests the institution actually serves. Over 670 schools were closed. The University of Puerto Rico, the single most effective vehicle for lifting Puerto Ricans into the middle class, had its budget cut by 50% and its tuition tripled. Research showed that every $1 million spent by the university generates about $1.56 million in total economic activity on the island. La Junta's response was to gut it. Healthcare spending was cut. Pensions were slashed. The minimum wage was lowered for some workers. Infrastructure investment was frozen. Puerto Ricans had tried austerity before. They tried it in 2009. It made everything worse, accelerating out migration and further shrinking the tax base that the government depended on. But La Junta kept demanding more cuts because their job wasn't to rebuild Puerto Rico. Their job was to make sure the creditors got paid. The island's healthcare system was already buckling. Puerto Ricans pay into Social Security and Medicare just like every American. But Medicaid in Puerto Rico operates under statutory caps. The island receives far less federal health funding per person than any U.S. state, and it has no political representation to change that. The result? Well, doctors are paid less, specialists are systematically underfunded, and the people who train on the island's dime leave for better salaries on the mainland. In 2009, there were 14,500 physicians in Puerto Rico. In 2024, there were roughly 9,000, serving a population of 3.2 million people. That's not a statistic. That's a slow-motion collapse. Patients wait months to see a specialist. Emergency rooms overflow. And an island where roughly 41% of the population lives in poverty, with some of the highest rates of diabetes and cardiovascular disease in the U.S. system, is trying to hold together a healthcare network with half of the doctors it had 20 years ago. Hey, if you're finding this breakdown valuable, make sure you're subscribed to Fall of Nations, because what's coming next explains why this isn't a problem that Puerto Rico can simply fix on its own. And then, on September 20th of 2017, the storm hit. Hurricane Maria made landfall as a powerful Category 4, with sustained winds that shredded the island's already fragile infrastructure. Hundreds of thousands of homes were damaged. The entire power grid went down. Every single customer on the island lost electricity. Within hours, Puerto Rico was effectively a disaster zone without functioning hospitals, roads, communications, or supply chains. The federal response was, to put it charitably, catastrophic. 9 days after Hurricane Harvey struck Texas, FEMA had approved $141.8 million in aid. 9 days after Hurricane Maria struck Puerto Rico, a U.S. territory with U.S. citizens, FEMA had approved only $6.2 million. The Jones Act wasn't waived until 10 days after the storm, delaying the emergency supply chain further. President Trump's visit to the island 2 weeks into the crisis became one of the more surreal moments in recent American political history. You may remember he tossed paper towels at survivors, shooting them almost like a basketball. Around 3,000 people died, most of them not from the storm itself, but from what came after. Insulin that couldn't be kept cold, medical equipment without power, communities cut off for weeks while help never arrived. The vulture funds didn't wait for the bodies to be counted. The firm Golden Tree reportedly purchased Puerto Rican debt for roughly 15 cents on the dollar in the immediate aftermath of Maria, positioning itself to extract hundreds of millions from the recovery. And when the rubble was still being cleared, La Junta moved to privatize what was left. It took a full year to restore electricity to the entire island after Maria. When it finally came back on, the board used the crisis as cover to restructure the whole energy system, without a public vote, without meaningful Puerto Rican input. In 2021, Puerto Rico's power grid was handed to Luma Energy, a private consortium backed by American and Canadian companies, under a 15-year contract. The public had no vote. They had no oversight. Luma promised modernization and reliability, but what they discovered was something else entirely. Puerto Ricans pay 90.5% more for electricity than the U.S. average. Let that settle in for a second. On an island where the median household earns $27,000 a year, electricity costs nearly double what mainland Americans pay. And it's not even reliable. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, customers in Puerto Rico experienced an average of 27 hours of annual power interruptions between 2021 and 2024, not counting major storms. On April 16th of 2025, the entire island went dark. 1.4 million customers, every one of Luma's clients, plunged into a blackout. There was no storm that day, no hurricane, no extreme weather event. It was clear skies, a blue sky failure, a complete grid collapse under ordinary operating conditions. It was the third major island-wide blackout in less than 4 years. Only 8% of Puerto Rico's electricity comes from renewable sources, despite the island having abundant solar and wind potential. The grid keeps being rebuilt around imported fossil fuels on aging infrastructure because that arrangement is profitable for the companies involved. Rebuilding it around renewables would reduce dependence on those same companies, so it doesn't happen. But here's what nobody tells you. That's not even the most dangerous part of this story. The most dangerous part, it's not the blackouts. It isn't the debt. It isn't even the collapse of healthcare or education. The most dangerous part is what happens to a society when the people start to leave and don't come back. In 2004, Puerto Rico had 3.8 million people. Today, the island stands at about 3.2 million. Between 2010 and 2020 alone, 440,000 people left the island. It's not a statistic. That's almost the population of Miami gone in a decade. And projections from the World Bank and demographic research groups now estimate that by 2050, Puerto Rico's population could fall as low as 2.5 million. The people leaving aren't leaving randomly. They're young. They're educated. They're the doctors, the engineers, the teachers, the exact people the island needs to rebuild. And they're leaving because the math doesn't work. High electricity costs, a collapsing healthcare system, gutted universities, a job market structurally designed to serve multinational corporations rather than create local opportunity. Puerto Rico's fertility rate has fallen to one of the lowest on Earth, below Japan's, which itself has become a global symbol of demographic decline. The median age on the island is already past 46 and rising quickly, projected to reach nearly 55 by 2050. A quarter of the population is already over 65. The island is aging, and the young people who would normally sustain that aging population have already left or are leaving now. This creates a feedback loop with no natural exit. Fewer working-age people means less tax revenue. Less tax revenue means worse services. Worse services mean more people leave. More people leave, well, that means even less revenue. And so it goes, tightening with every cycle. The Center for Puerto Rican Studies has projected that if current trends continue, Puerto Rico will have fewer school-aged children, fewer taxpayers, and a smaller economic base than at any point in the last century, within the lifetimes of people alive today. Every economist who studies this dynamic says the same thing. You can't cut your way out of a demographic collapse. You need investment. You need people to stay. You need a reason to come back. Puerto Rico's current governance structure makes all three of those things structurally difficult to achieve. And into the emptying island, someone else is moving in. Act 60, Puerto Rico's tax incentive code, offers wealthy Americans who establish residency on the island something extraordinary. While those who arrived in 2026 still enjoy 0% tax on capital gains, dividends, and interest, new residents now pay a flat 4% tax on that income. That's still a fraction of mainland rates. The 4% corporate tax rate also remains, a stark contrast to the 21% federal rate on the mainland. Not available to Puerto Ricans who already live there, only to newcomers from the mainland. In 2025, those benefits were extended all the way to 2055. The island's government locked in the arrangement for 3 more decades. And the result has been a slow-motion buyout. Crypto millionaires, hedge fund managers, real estate investors, they've been arriving in growing numbers, snapping up beachfront properties and coastal neighborhoods at prices that no local family can compete with. A congressional analysis found that rent has spiked by up to 600% in certain areas. The median home listing in San Juan now exceeds $900,000, in a city where the average resident earns around $30,000 a year. Puerto Rico's beaches are legally public, but they're being fenced off. They're being developed and priced into exclusivity. John Paulson, the hedge fund billionaire who made his fortune betting against the U.S. housing market in 2008 and who later profited from Greece's debt crisis, has quietly been buying Puerto Rican land at distressed prices. The same pattern that played out in Athens is playing out in San Juan. GAO investigators found in December of 2025 that hundreds of millions in federal tax revenue is being drained through Act 60 abuses, with some beneficiaries not even living on the island the required number of days, while Puerto Rican families are picking up the tab. A Puerto Rico without Puerto Ricans, it's not a hypothetical anymore. It's arriving. So why doesn't someone fix this? That's the question you're probably asking right now. And the answer is the most infuriating part of the whole story. Puerto Rico cannot print its own currency. It uses the dollar. It cannot set its own trade policy. It can't negotiate treaties. It can't meaningfully change its minimum wage, which is set by Congress. When it tried to pass its own debt restructuring law in 2015, the U.S. Supreme Court struck it down. When it tried to declare bankruptcy in 2006, it couldn't. That 1984 law was still in place. Promesa was supposed to be the solution, but instead it created La Junta, which has been overriding the elected Puerto Rican government ever since. Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. They serve in the U.S. military at higher rates than most states. They pay into federal programs, and yet they cannot vote for the president who appoints the unelected board that runs their island. This isn't a technicality. It's the architecture of the whole system. The people who benefit from Puerto Rico's current arrangement, the pharmaceutical companies, the shipping monopolies protected by the Jones Act, the vulture funds, the Act 60 tax refugees, none of them have any incentive to change it. And the people who could change it, the U.S. Congress, have consistently prioritized those interests over the 3.2 million Americans living on the island. Today, in 2026, Puerto Rico is still generating billions. The drugs still ship, the factories still run, La Junta still meets, the blackouts still happen, and the doctors are still leaving. The young people are still on flights to Orlando and New York with suitcases and no plans to return. Puerto Rico isn't running out of money. It's trapped in a system where the money was never really meant to stay. So here's the question that we want to leave you with. When a territory this productive, this integrated into the world's most powerful economy, ends up with about 41% of its people in poverty and a disappearing population, is that a failure, or is it just the system working exactly as intended? Let us know what you think in the comments, and subscribe to Fall of Nations, because the story of how powerful systems hollow out the places they claim to serve is one that we are going to keep following.